He came back with his mistress on his arm, smiling like a man who had done nothing wrong. 6 months. No letters. No word. Nothing. And Frederick Pembroke truly believed his wife would be standing at that door, broken weeping, desperate to take him back. But the woman who opened that door, she wasn't broken. She wasn't weeping. She was running his estate better than he ever had. And the look on her face when she saw him, it wasn't grief. It was something far worse. Pity. If you've ever loved someone who only noticed your worth after they nearly lost you, stay with us. This story is for you. The carriage wheels ground against the gravel of Pembroke Manor on a gray October morning in 1818, and Frederick Pembroke did not feel guilty. He had told himself that many times during the 3-day journey north from London. He had said it over breakfast at the inn in Leeds. He had repeated it quietly in his own mind as the Yorkshire moors rolled past the frosted carriage window, brown and endless and cold. I do not feel guilty, because guilt was for men who had done something wrong. And Frederick Earl of Pembroke had simply done what men of his station did. He had grown bored. He had found amusement elsewhere. He had allowed himself 6 months of pleasure in the city, while his country estate ran itself as it always had, as it always would. And now he was returning home with every intention of resuming his comfortable, well-ordered life. Isabella Vane sat across from him in the carriage, her gloved hand resting lightly on his knee. She was laughing at some small joke he had made about Yorkshire weather, and her laugh was the kind that men in London drawing rooms called musical. Light. Practiced. She was 29 years old, and she had never once in her life looked anything less than perfectly arranged. "You're certain she won't make a scene?" Isabella murmured, glancing out the window as the iron gates of Pembroke Manor came into view. "Caroline." Frederick almost smiled. "She has never made a scene in her life. That is both her greatest virtue and her most significant failing." Isabella tilted her head, studying him with those sharp dark eyes. "And you're not the least bit worried?" "About what precisely?" "About walking through your own front door with me." Frederick adjusted the cuff of his coat. "Caroline will be gracious. She is always gracious. She will offer you tea. She will say the correct things. And then she and I will have a quiet conversation this evening, and everything will return to normal." Isabella said nothing, but something in her expression shifted just slightly, just enough that a more observant man might have noticed it. Frederick did not notice. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. Frederick stepped down onto the gravel drive of Pembroke Manor, breathed in the cold Yorkshire air, and looked up at the face of his ancestral home. And immediately, he knew something was different. He could not have said precisely what it was. The stone was the same. The ivy was the same. The great oak doors at the top of the entry steps were the same dark weathered wood they had always been. But something was different. The grounds, for one. They were, he searched for the word, tended. More than tended. The hedgerows were trimmed in clean lines. The gravel drive had been freshly raked. 2 groundsmen were working near the east garden wall, and they moved with the quiet efficiency of men who knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing and why. 6 months ago, those same groundsmen had moved at the shuffling, uncertain pace of men who had not been properly supervised in years. Frederick had noticed it vaguely and done nothing about it. He noticed now. He walked up the front, Isabella behind him, and the great oak doors opened before he could reach for the handle. Thomas Gray, the senior house steward, stood in the doorway. He was a man of 53, with the kind of face that had seen every variety of human foolishness and learned to reveal nothing about any of it. He gave a correct, measured bow. "Lord Pembroke, welcome home." Gray. Frederick stepped into the entrance hall. "Is Lady Pembroke?" "She is expecting you, my lord." Frederick paused. The entrance hall was also different. It took him a moment to understand how. The arrangement of the furniture was subtly altered, more functional, less ornamental. The side table that had always held a collection of decorative silver pieces he had inherited and never cared about was now cleared, holding only a neat stack of correspondence. The Turkish carpet had been turned so that its best side faced the light from the window. Small things. Precise things. Things that suggested someone had looked at this room with fresh, purposeful eyes. Caroline, he thought with a vague unease he refused to examine too closely. And then he heard footsteps on the staircase, and he looked up. Caroline Wentworth Pembroke came down the stairs the way a woman descends who has decided exactly who she is. Not hurrying, not performing. Simply moving with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who knows where she stands in her own house. She wore a dress of deep blue, simple, expensive, well-fitted. No jewelry except small pearl earrings. Her dark hair was dressed plainly away from her face. She looked, Frederick thought with sudden and inexplicable discomfort, entirely like herself. More herself somehow than he had ever seen her. She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked at him. Not at Isabella. At him. Directly, steadily, without drama. "Welcome home, Lord Pembroke." Not my husband. Not Frederick. Lord Pembroke. The same words one used to greet an acquaintance. A neighbor. A man you knew by name, but not by heart. Frederick felt something cold move through him. He pushed it aside. "Caroline." He stepped forward, leaned to press a formal kiss to her cheek. She accepted it without moving away, but also without moving toward him. "You look well." "Thank you." She turned her gaze to Isabella, composed, courteous, and utterly unreadable. "Miss Vane, I trust your journey was comfortable." Isabella blinked. Barely perceptibly, but she blinked. She had clearly prepared for tears, or for cold fury, or for some variety of dramatic confrontation. She had not prepared for this. "Quite comfortable, thank you," Isabella managed. "The blue room has been prepared for you," Caroline continued. "If you require anything, please ring for Sarah. She has been assigned to assist you." Then she looked back at Frederick. "I've arranged tea in the green parlor. The estate accounts are on the library table. I assumed you would want to review them." Frederick stopped. "The estate accounts." "Yes." "I have just arrived." "Yes," Caroline agreed pleasantly. "And the accounts need to be reviewed. Thomas can walk you through the changes, or I can, whichever you prefer." She said it the way one might say, "Whichever soup you prefer," politely, matter-of-factly, as though offering him a choice between two equally reasonable options. Frederick stared at his wife. He had been away for 6 months. He had returned with another woman. And his wife was discussing estate accounts. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we might speak privately first." "Of course," Caroline said. "After you've had time to rest and review the accounts. Shall we say 7 o'clock this evening?" And then she turned, not dismissively, not dramatically. Simply turned and said to Thomas Gray, "Please see that Lord Pembroke's rooms are ready. He'll want a bath after traveling." Then to Isabella, "I'll have someone show you upstairs." She walked back up the staircase. Frederick stood in the entrance hall of his own ancestral home and watched his wife disappear around the landing. And for the first time in 6 months, he was not sure what he had expected to find here, but it had not been this. The estate accounts were a revelation of the worst possible kind. Frederick sat in the library with a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, working through ledger after ledger, while the clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward 6. Thomas Gray sat across from him, straight-backed, answering every question with the careful precision of a man walking through a minefield he had not personally laid. "This figure here," Frederick said, tapping a line in the August ledger. "This reduction in the estate manager's annual sum." "Yes, my lord." "Explain it." Thomas Gray cleared his throat. "Mr. Hendricks was removed from his position in July, my lord." Frederick looked up slowly. "I beg your pardon." "Removed, at Lady Pembroke's direction." Frederick set down the ledger. "The estate manager," he said very quietly. "The man who has managed Pembroke Manor for 11 years. "Yes, my lord. My wife removed him. She discovered he had been systematically underreporting the farm income and diverting funds." Thomas Gray's voice remained perfectly level. "Approximately £400 over the previous 2 years from what the solicitor was able to determine. Lady Pembroke engaged Mr. Whitmore from Harrogate to conduct an audit. The discrepancy was confirmed and Mr. Hendricks was dismissed." Frederick was silent for a long moment. "She engaged a solicitor." "She did, without consulting me." "She wrote to you in April, my lord, and again in May." Thomas Gray paused with the delicacy of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The letters were not returned, so she assumed they were received. Fredericks remembered the letters. He had recognized Caroline's handwriting on the envelopes and had not opened them. Not out of cruelty precisely, more out of a vague disinclination to be reminded of responsibilities he was enjoying ignoring. He said nothing. "There is also the matter of the Northfield harvest," Thomas Gray continued, as if Frederick's silence were itself an answer. "The rains in August were severe. Lady Pembroke negotiated an arrangement with the Hargreaves estate to use their drainage system for 3 weeks in exchange for a share of the crop yield. It saved approximately 2/3 of the Northfield harvest." She negotiated with Lord Hargreaves. She did. Personally. Yes, my lord. Lord Hargreaves was initially resistant to the arrangement. Her ladyship met with him twice. The second meeting she brought the yield projections prepared by the new estate manager. A small pause. He agreed to the terms. Frederick stared at the ledger in front of him. The numbers were neat and careful and brutally clear. The estate was not merely solvent, it was in better financial condition than it had been in 3 years. Not because Frederick had done anything, because Caroline had. He turned to the next page and stopped. A column of payments, small amounts repeated weekly. His eyes moved to the recipient column. "The tenants," he said. "These payments." "Yes, my lord." Mr. Hendricks had also been withholding a portion of the wages owed to the day laborers on the home farm. Lady Pembroke reviewed the original employment agreements and calculated the arrears. She arranged repayment from the estate accounts. She paid the tenants money they were owed. The wages Mr. Hendricks had kept, yes. From estate funds. Yes, my lord. Thomas Gray looked at him with the expression of a man who has answered enough questions to understand which ones were being asked for information and which ones were being asked for another reason entirely. "With respect, my lord, the funds were legally owed to them. Lady Pembroke simply ensured they received what was theirs." Frederick closed the ledger. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and tried to organize the strange, uncomfortable sensation working its way through his chest into something he could name. He had come home expecting Caroline to be waiting, to be unhappy and waiting and ultimately forgiving the way she had always been in the version of this story he had constructed in his own head. He had come home expecting to find his wife exactly where he had left her, standing in the wings of his life, patient and available and relieved at his return. Instead, he had found his accounts in order, his estate better managed than it had ever been under his own supervision, and his wife as warm and welcoming and completely distant as a polished mirror. He went to find her at 7 o'clock. She was in the sitting room adjacent to the master bedroom, the room that had always been considered hers rather than theirs. The small, well-lit space where she kept her correspondence and her books and the needlework she rarely touched, because she always had something more useful to do. She was writing at her desk when he knocked and entered. She capped her pen and turned to face him with an expression of perfect neutral attention. He pulled a chair close to her desk and sat. He had planned something to say, a speech of sorts. He had been thinking about it since the carriage ride. "The accounts," he began. "Yes. You've been, the estate is." He stopped, started again. "You've done an extraordinary amount of work. It needed to be done. Caroline." He looked at her directly. "You didn't have to manage all of this alone." Something crossed her face, not anger, not hurt, something quieter and more complete than either. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." "Then why?" "Because you were in London." She said it without accusation, the way one might state that the sky was gray or that the autumn had turned cold. Simply a fact, simply the condition of things. "And the estate didn't stop needing to be managed simply because you weren't here. You could have written." "I did write." The words landed quietly. They landed like stones dropped into still water, no splash, just the ripple going outward. "I wrote in April," Caroline continued, "and in May. I told you about Mr. Hendricks. I told you about the harvest concerns. I told you the Northfield was flooding." She folded her hands in her lap. "You did not respond." Frederick opened his mouth, closed it. "So I did what needed doing," Caroline said. "Because it was my home too. Because the tenants and the laborers and the people who depend on this estate Couldn't wait for you to find it convenient to return. Caroline, I'm not angry with you, Frederick. And the terrible undeniable thing was that she wasn't. He could see it. He had always been able to read her well enough to know when she was suppressing emotion, and she was not suppressing anything now. I was angry for a while in the spring. I'm not anymore. Then what are you? She was quiet for a moment. I am someone who spent 6 months learning exactly what she is capable of, and I find that I no longer know how to go back to who I was before. Frederick looked at his wife. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years, and he saw something that should have been there when he married her, that perhaps had always been there, that he had simply been too busy, too comfortable, too certain of her to notice. She was not waiting for him. She had stopped waiting. The woman you came home expecting to find, Caroline said quietly. She's gone, Frederick. I'm not sure she was ever really here to begin with. I think I was just very good at pretending to be her. Frederick had no idea what to say. He had never in 11 years of marriage not known what to say to Caroline. Isabella Vane, he began. You don't need to explain her to me. Caroline, I know who she is. Her voice remained even. I have known for some time. There are things I know about Isabella Vane and her family that I suspect even you don't know. She rose from her chair gracefully, unhurriedly, with the same quiet command she had shown on the staircase. But that is a conversation for another day, when you are rested, and I am finished with the correspondence I still need to send before tomorrow morning. She moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him over her shoulder. I'm glad you're home safe, she said. I mean that genuinely. Good night, Lord Pembroke. She left. Frederick sat alone in her sitting room for a very long time, surrounded by her books and her correspondence, and the faint scent of the rosewater she had always used, and he tried to understand what had happened to him. He had come home. He had come home and found his house running better than he had ever managed it. He had found his tenants paid his fields, saved his accounts honest and balanced and clean. He had found a woman he had believed was simply waiting for him to return, and discovered that she had somewhere in the 6 months of his absence become someone entirely else, someone who didn't need him anymore. The worst part, he realized, as the fire burned low and the candle guttered on the mantelpiece, was not that the thought hurt. The worst part was that it should have, and that he was only just now beginning to understand why. He saw Isabella briefly before dinner. She found him in the east corridor, looking at the portrait gallery, a thing he had never done by choice in all his years of living here. Well, Isabella said, coming to stand beside him. Your wife is not what I expected. No, Frederick agreed. She's very composed. She is. It's a bit unnerving, if I'm honest. Isabella studied the portrait of his great-grandmother, who stared back from the canvas with the same cool, unanswerable composure as Caroline. Most women in her position would have, I know what most women would have done. A pause. Then, are you all right? Frederick looked at the portrait. His great-grandmother had managed this estate during the years his great-grandfather had been in London, doing God knows what, with God knows whom, and she had apparently done it with the kind of iron-handed efficiency that had passed into family legend. He had always thought of it as an admirable but historical footnote. It occurred to him for the first time that it might have been something else. I reviewed the accounts, he said. And the estate has been better managed in the past 6 months than in the previous 3 years. He said it flatly, without drama, a simple and undeniable truth. She caught a man stealing from us that I trusted for 11 years. She saved the Northfield harvest. She paid back wages to the farm laborers that my own estate manager had been withholding. Isabella was quiet. All of this, Frederick said, while I was in London attending parties and assuming everything was fine. Frederick, I don't want comfort, Isabella. He turned away from the portrait. I want... He stopped because he wasn't sure what he wanted. That was the problem. For the first time in a very long time, what he wanted was something he could not simply reach out and take. I want to understand what exactly I thought I was coming home to. He walked away down the corridor. The candles in their sconces flickered in the draught from the high window, and the portraits of the dead Pembrokes, watched him go with the patient, expressionless regard of people who have nothing more to prove. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, and the last footstep had faded from the upstairs corridors, Frederick stood at the window of his bedchamber and looked out across the grounds of Pembroke Manor. The moon was full and cold. It silvered the hedgerows and the lawns, and the long line of the lane leading to the tenant farms, everything precise and still, and absolutely clear in the autumn dark. Somewhere on those farms were men and women who had worked this land for years, some of them their whole lives, men and women who had been cheated of wages they were owed by a man Frederick had trusted, and who had been repaid not by the lord of the manor, returning in triumph, but by his wife working quietly and persistently from a desk in the house, reading old agreements and checking old figures and doing what was right because no one else was going to do it. He thought about Thomas Gray's face when he described it. The perfect neutrality of it. The diplomatic precision of someone who was being very careful not to say, "You should be ashamed." He thought about Caroline on the staircase. "Welcome, Lord Pembroke." He thought about what she had said. "The woman you came home expecting to find is gone." He pressed his fingers against the cold glass of the window. For 36 years, Frederick Pembroke had moved through his life with the comfortable certainty of a man who has never had to question what he deserves. He was the Earl of Pembroke. He had been raised to a title, to land, to consequence. People came to him. Doors opened. Things arranged themselves around him with the smooth, inevitable logic of a world built to accommodate his existence. He had married Caroline Wentworth because she was sensible and well-bred and pretty, and would make an excellent countess. He had not married her because he loved her, not the kind of love that saw her, not the kind that noticed. He had married her the way one acquires a piece of excellent furniture, with genuine appreciation for its quality, and no particular anxiety about its comfort. And Caroline quiet, composed, capable. Caroline had been, he realized now, quietly competent in his presence, the same way she had been competent in his absence. The difference was that in his presence he had received the credit. In his absence she had simply been left with the work. He turned away from the window. He needed to speak with her again. He wasn't sure what he needed. He was not a man who apologized easily, and he was beginning to suspect that apology alone would not be sufficient for whatever it was he had broken. She had said there were things she knew about Isabella Vane that he didn't. He had been so startled by everything else that he had let it pass. But now, in the dark quiet of his room, with the moonlight making the whole estate look like something carved from silver and bone, he turned that sentence over in his mind. "I know who she is. There are things I know about Isabella Vane and her family that I suspect even you don't know." She had said it without dramatic emphasis, without the weight of a threat or the lightness of a careless remark. She had said it the way she said everything, directly and truly, as if the facts of the matter were simply the facts of the matter, and she expected him to be capable of receiving them. He had not written back to her letters in the spring. He had assumed everything was fine. He had assumed she was waiting. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. The room was growing cold. And Frederick Pembroke, Earl of Pembroke, stood alone in the dark of his ancestral home, and understood perhaps for the first time in his life that there was a difference between possessing something and deserving it. He had spent 36 years confusing those two things. He was beginning to wonder, with a hollow, unfamiliar ache in his chest, whether he had time enough left to learn the difference. Has a man in your life ever taken you completely for granted, only to realize too late exactly what he had? Caroline's story is just getting started, and what she knows about Isabella Vane will change everything. Stay with us, and if the story speaks to you, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The morning after Frederick Pembroke returned to his own home and felt like a stranger in it, he did something he had not done in years. He woke before dawn, not because he had slept poorly, though he had. Not because the Yorkshire cold had crept through the old window frames and settled in his bones, though it had. He woke before dawn because somewhere in the fitful, uneasy hours between midnight and morning he had made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what Caroline knew, and he was going to find out before Isabella Vane came down to breakfast. He dressed without ringing for his valet. That alone was strange enough that when he passed one of the upstairs maids in the corridor, she startled visibly and nearly dropped the linens she was carrying. "My lord." "Carry on." He kept walking. The house was already awake, in the way that great houses are always awake long before their masters notice fires being lit, water being carried, bread already rising in the kitchen below. The sounds of industry invisible and constant, the kind of work that happens so that men like Frederick Pembroke can move through their days without ever thinking about who makes them possible. He found Caroline in the estate office, not the library where the formal ledgers were kept. The estate office, the smaller plainer room at the back of the east wing that the estate manager had traditionally occupied, the room where the real work happened, where the correspondence with tenants was written, where the repair orders were signed, where the wage books were kept. She was already at the desk. A cup of tea sat at her elbow, half finished. She had a letter open in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she did not look up immediately when he entered, which meant she had heard him coming and had decided to finish her sentence first. That too was new. The Caroline he remembered would have looked up the moment he appeared in a doorway, would have set everything aside, would have been immediately and completely available to him. "You're up early," she said, setting the pen down. "I needed to speak with you." "So I gathered." She folded the letter and set it to one side. "Sit down, Frederick." He sat. The chair across from her desk was hard-backed and utilitarian, the kind meant for tenants and tradesmen, not for earls. He sat in it anyway. "Last night," he began, "you said there were things you knew about Isabella Vane and her family, things you believed I didn't know." "Yes." "Tell me." Caroline looked at him for a moment, not assessing exactly, more as though she were deciding something, not what to tell him, but how to begin. Then she opened the center drawer of the desk and removed a small, neat bundle of papers tied with brown string. She placed them on the desk between them, but did not push them toward him. "In March," she said. "2 weeks after you left for London, I received a visit from a man named Archibald Fenner. He represented himself as a solicitor from Leeds. He came to discuss, as he put it, certain opportunities regarding the Pembroke estate." Frederick's eyes moved to the bundle of papers. What kind of opportunities? The kind that require the lord of the manor to be absent deeply in debt or deeply distracted. She folded her hands on the desk. "He presented me with a proposal informal. He was very careful to call it informal, suggesting that a consortium of investors would be interested in acquiring the mineral rights to the northern portion of the Pembroke land, the coal seams specifically." Frederick went very still. "The coal seams on the north boundary." "Yes. Those seams are worth—" "I know what they're worth, Frederick." Her voice was patient, even. "I had them independently assessed in April. They are worth considerably more than Mr. Fenner's consortium proposed to pay for them." He stared at her. "You had them assessed?" "I did, because Mr. Fenner's offer was insultingly low, and because I found it curious that he seemed very well informed about the state of the estate accounts, information that should not have been available to a stranger from Leeds." She paused. "It took me 6 weeks, but I eventually traced how he obtained that information." "Hendricks." The name came out of Frederick's mouth before he fully processed the thought. Hendricks was providing financial information to Fenner's consortium, in exchange for— She stopped. "In exchange for having his own considerable gambling debts retired." The silence in the estate office was absolute. Outside, distantly, a cart moved on the lane. Inside, nothing. "And the consortium," Frederick said slowly. He looked at the bundle of papers on the desk. "Who are they, Caroline?" She untied the brown string. She spread 3 sheets of paper on the desk, careful, methodical, the way she did everything. She turned them so he could read them. He leaned forward. The names on the papers were not immediately familiar. A merchant house in Leeds, a property company in Sheffield, an investment partnership in London. He read the partnership name twice, then a third time, because the second reading had not made sense. The London Investment Partnership was registered under the name of Gerald Vane, Isabella's older brother. Frederick sat back in his chair. The blood had left his face. He could feel it, the cold spreading downward from his temples. "Gerald Vane," he said. Yes. Isabella's brother. Yes. She knew about this. He said it not as a question, but as a man watching the architecture of something he believed solid collapse quietly in front of him. She knew about this the entire time. I can't say with certainty what she knew, Caroline replied carefully. What I can tell you is that Gerald Vane has been a principal in this consortium since before you left for London. The original approach to Hendricks was made in January. You left in April. January. Frederick thought about January. About the party at Lord Ashfield's townhouse where he had first met Isabella Vane. That precise, calculated introduction, the way she had appeared at exactly the right moment, the way the conversation had turned so naturally toward Yorkshire, toward the estate, toward his general discontent with country life. She engineered it, he said quietly. The introduction, the whole, I don't know that. Caroline's voice was firm. Not protective of Isabella, protective of accuracy. What I know is what the documents show. What conclusions you draw from them is your own business. Caroline. He looked at her across the desk. You've known this since when did you put all of this together? I had most of it by June. June. 4 months ago. 4 months during which she had said nothing, written letters he hadn't opened, and quietly gone about the work of protecting an estate whose owner was in London, in the company of a woman whose family may have been using him as a means to steal it. Why didn't you? He stopped. He already knew the answer. She had already told him the answer the night before in her sitting room. Because 6 months ago you chose not to listen. He had never in his life felt quite this particular sensation. It was not shame exactly. Shame was certainly part of it. It was something closer to the feeling of standing in a room you've lived in your whole life and suddenly seeing all of its actual dimensions for the first time. What did you do? He said. When you had the evidence. I secured it. She gathered the papers back into their neat bundle. I had copies made and deposited with Mr. Whitmore in Harrogate and with my father's former solicitor in Lincolnshire. I informed the estate's bank of a potential attempt to misrepresent my husband's authority in any land transaction, and I engaged a second solicitor to prepare a legal brief on the protection of mineral rights under Yorkshire property law. Each sentence landed like a slow, careful blow. Not aimed at him, aimed at the problem, but landing on him nonetheless, because the problem had existed because of him, because of his absence, because of his complete and comfortable certainty that someone else would manage things. You built a legal defense, he said, around an attack you hadn't told me about. An attack you weren't here to be told about. Caroline, I'm not reproaching you. She tied the string around the papers again and placed them back in the drawer. I'm answering your question. You asked what I did. That is what I did. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, the consortium. Have they approached again since Hendricks was dismissed? 3 weeks ago, a different representative, this time a man named Poole. He came with a revised offer for the mineral rights higher than the first. She looked at him steadily. I told him that any proposal regarding Pembroke estate assets would need to be submitted formally to Lord Pembroke's legal representatives, and that any further informal approaches would be considered trespass. You turned him away. I turned him away. By yourself. There was no one else to turn him away with. Frederick stood up from the hard chair. He walked to the window of the estate office and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at nothing, simply needing somewhere to put the enormity of what he was processing. His wife had spent 6 months fighting to protect an estate, while he was in London, being maneuvered by the very woman he'd thought he was choosing freely. He turned around. I need to go to London. I expected you would. I need to speak with Gerald Vane, and with my own solicitors, and I need to... He stopped. There was something else. Something that needed to be said before strategy, before legal proceedings, before any of the practical matters that were already assembling themselves in his mind, with the urgent clarity of a man who has just understood that something important is genuinely at risk. Caroline. She looked up at him. I owe you an apology that I am not yet capable of making correctly. The words came out stiffly, imperfectly, the way real things come out of men who have not practiced saying them. I want you to know that I understand that. I'm asking you not to make any decisions until I've had the chance to. I haven't made any decisions. Her voice was quiet. I'm not in the habit of making decisions rashly. You should know that by now. He looked at her. She looked back at him. In the gray October light of that plain functional room, he saw his wife's face with a clarity that felt almost physical. The steadiness in it, the intelligence in it, the careful, contained dignity of a woman who had been underestimated by someone she trusted and had decided without bitterness to simply become more than that underestimation. I'll be gone 2 days, he said. 3 at most. I'll have Thomas arrange the carriage. She was already reaching for her pen. Safe travels, Lord Pembroke. He left the room. Behind him, he heard the quiet scratch of her pen resuming where it had left off. She had not paused for him. She had finished her sentence. She had set the letter aside when he arrived, and she had gone straight back to it the moment he left. She was not waiting for him. She had stopped waiting. He didn't know yet whether that fact filled him with grief or admiration. It was possible he was beginning to understand that it was both. He found Isabella in the morning room. She had arranged herself near the window in the particular way she had artfully natural-studied carelessness, and she was pretending to read a book whose pages she had not. From what Frederick could observe as he entered, turned in the past 15 minutes. She looked up. She smiled. It was a beautiful smile, practiced and warm, and he now noticed with new and uncomfortable acuity, precisely calculated. You look troubled, she said. Isabella. He closed the door behind him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Something moved behind her eyes. Fast, small, quickly controlled. Of course. Your brother Gerald. The movement again. Faster this time, and less successfully controlled. She turned her face slightly not away, just fractionally to the side, the way people move when they are reorganizing what they intend to say. What about Gerald? He has a financial interest in a consortium that has been attempting to acquire mineral rights on this estate. Silence. The kind of silence that is itself an answer. Did you know about it? Frederick. That's not an answer. She set the book down. When she looked at him, the smile was gone, and what replaced it was something more complicated, not guilt exactly, but the face of a woman who has been careful for a long time and has just been asked to stop being careful. Gerald has various business interests, she said. I don't involve myself in them. That's also not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you. He studied her. He had thought in London that he knew her. He had thought she was a straightforward creature, amusing, beautiful, eager to be in the company of a titled man with a good estate. He understood now that he had confused legibility with simplicity. She was not simple. She was performing simplicity the same way she performed everything else. I'm going to London today, he said. I'm going to speak with Gerald. She rose from her chair. Frederick, don't do anything impulsive. Gerald is involved in a scheme to acquire assets from my estate at below market value, using information illegally obtained from a member of my staff. His voice was even. He had his father's voice when he wanted it flat cold, absolutely certain. That is not impulsive. That is a legal matter. You don't have proof. My wife has proof. He watched her face carefully when he said it. She's had it since June. The color left Isabella's face so thoroughly and so quickly that it was almost remarkable. All the artful composure, all the studied grace. It didn't disappear exactly, but it cracked just at the edges, just enough to see through. Your wife, she repeated. Yes. He picked up his gloves from the side table. My wife, who has spent 6 months building a legal case while I was in London with you, completely unaware that I was being made a fool of. He paused at the door. I want you gone from this house by the time I return, Isabella. I'll arrange for a carriage to take you to the posting inn. You can make your way back to London from there. Frederick. He opened the door. We could... Her voice caught something real for a moment. Not the manufactured warmth, but something underneath it, some actual feeling she had perhaps not intended to show. It doesn't have to end like this. He looked back at her. Tell me one true thing. he said quietly. Just one. Did you care for me at all, or was I always only a means to the estate? She was silent for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds he had his answer. I thought so. He left. The ride to London took 2 days. Frederick spent most of them thinking. This was itself unusual. Frederick Pembroke was not by nature or habit a man who examined his own interior landscape with any particular rigor. He had feelings the way everyone had feelings. They arose, they passed. He acted on these practical ones and ignored the rest. Introspection struck him as a somewhat self-indulgent occupation, more suited to poets than to men who had estates to run. Estates which he now acknowledged with the grinding discomfort of genuine reckoning he had not actually been running. He thought about Caroline in that estate office at dawn. The half-finished cup of tea. The letter she was already writing before the house was properly awake. The way she had laid those papers out on the desk, not with triumph, not with reproach, simply with the calm efficiency of a woman presenting facts to someone who needed to understand them. I thought about what it must have been like to receive that visit from Fenner in March alone with no husband to consult, no authority to invoke except her own. To understand what it meant to begin the slow, patient work of investigation and documentation, to carry all of it month after month without telling anyone, because there was no one to tell. She had not told him because he had not opened her letters. The carriage rolled through the dark. Frederick looked at his own hands. I was not a man who had ever spent much time contemplating what his wife did or felt or thought, beyond the immediate context of her interactions with him. She had always simply been there, competent, pleasant, managing his household, making his social obligations run smoothly, the warm and reliable background of his life. He had been grateful for her in the abstract, the way one is grateful for a good coat or a reliable horse, sincerely, but without depth. I was beginning to understand that gratitude without attention is just another form of indifference. Gerald Vane received him the following morning in his London townhouse with the wary over-courtesy of a man who has received an unexpected visit from someone with very good reasons to be angry. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with Isabella's dark eyes and none of her careful surface charm. Lord Pembroke. He gestured to a chair. I wasn't expecting. I know you weren't. Frederick remained standing. He placed Caroline's copies of the documents on Gerald Vane's desk. He had asked her permission to take them before he left, and she had given it without hesitation, along with a second set already prepared. She had, of course, already prepared a second set. Gerald looked at the papers. His jaw tightened. My wife, Frederick said, has been in possession of these documents since June. She chose not to use them as leverage. She chose not to inform me in a way designed to create maximum damage to your family. She simply protected the estate, quietly, without drama. He watched Gerald's face carefully. I want you to understand the person you were attempting to defraud so that you appreciate the full magnitude of your error. Gerald looked up. Lord Pembroke, the consortium will withdraw its interest in Pembroke Mineral Rights, formally in writing to my solicitors within the week. Fenner and Poole will not approach the estate again. In return, I will not pursue criminal proceedings because my wife's preference, which she expressed to me this morning, is to resolve this matter quietly without causing unnecessary scandal to anyone's family. Gerald stared at him. Lady Pembroke made that preference clear. Frederick picked up his gloves. She is, as it happens, a considerably more merciful person than I am. I would strongly advise you to be grateful for that. He left Gerald Vane sitting behind his desk, staring at the documents his sister's introduction had been designed to make possible in the townhouse that had been built in part on the expectation of money that had not come. Frederick stood on the London street outside and breathed in the cold city air and thought about his wife. She had known. She had protected him, protected his estate, protected his name, protected his interests, while he had been failing to protect her most basic expectation of a husband. She had done it without asking for recognition, without using it as currency. She had simply done it because it was the right thing to do, and because the estate needed it, and because she was underneath all the quiet composure, someone who did not know how to do anything halfway. He had married that woman 11 years ago, and spent 11 years not seeing her. He began to understand that the journey back to Yorkshire was going to be a great deal harder than the journey away from it. Not because of the distance, because of the conversation that waited at the end of it. The conversation he owed her. Not the apology, though the apology was necessary and would be difficult, and he intended to make it properly, without hedging. Without Frederick Pembroke's lifelong habit of making his admissions of fault sound like explanations. He owed her more than an apology. He owed her the truth about what he had failed to be. And he owed it to her without any expectation that the debt could be discharged simply by the stating of it. He returned to his hotel. He sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first to his solicitors instructing them to expect Gerald Vane's written withdrawal and to prepare for any eventuality if it did not arrive promptly. The second letter he wrote 3 times before he got it right. It was shorter than he expected. That surprised him. It said, "I have been to London. The matter is being resolved. I will be home in 2 days. I am beginning to understand things I should have understood years ago. I am not asking you for anything. I simply wanted you to know." He signed it Frederick, not Lord Pembroke, not your husband, just his name, the one she had not used since he came home. He sent the letter. Then he sat alone in his hotel room and thought about the word home and what it had meant to him before this week. And what if he was honest? Really honest in the dark alone with no one watching? He was beginning to understand it might actually mean. The carriage arrived at Pembroke Manor on a Tuesday evening, just as the lamps were being lit in the front rooms. Frederick stepped down onto the gravel drive. Thomas Gray was not at the door. Neither was Caroline. A young footman opened this door and took his coat. "Lady Pembroke is in the library, my lord." He walked to the library. He knocked. He went in. She was at the reading table, and this time she did look up when he entered. She looked up and watched him cross the room and sit down in the chair across from her, without any of the neutral pleasantness of their previous meetings. She was simply watching him, waiting to see what he would do. He did not make a speech. "I went to Gerald Vane," he said. "He'll withdraw the consortium's claim in writing by the end of the week. I have our solicitor watching for it." "Good." I confronted Isabella. A pause. "How did that go?" "I asked her whether she had ever cared for me, or whether I was always only a means to the estate." He looked at his wife steadily. She didn't answer, which was, of course, an answer. Something moved across Caroline's face, not satisfaction, not pity, something quieter and more complicated than either. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been difficult." It was such an unexpected thing for her to say. He had expected neutrality. He had expected reserve. He had not expected her to be sorry for him, and the simplicity of it, the genuine unguarded quality of it, caught him entirely off guard. "Don't be sorry for me," he said roughly. "I don't deserve your sympathy." "You're a person, Frederick. Persons can be deceived." She looked at him steadily. "That doesn't excuse everything else. But it's also not nothing." I was quiet for a long moment. "I read your letters," he said. "I mean, I know what was in them now. Gray told me. You told me. I understand what you were trying to reach me about." He stopped. This was the hardest part. "I recognized your handwriting on the envelopes, Caroline. In April and in May. I recognized it and I set them aside." She said nothing. "Not because I was angry at you. Not because I didn't care. Because He searched for the honest word. "Because I did not want to be reminded of what I was neglecting. Because it was easier not to know. Because I was very comfortable, and you made everything comfortable, and I had spent 11 years trusting that you would continue to do so without ever asking myself what that was costing you." The clock ticked on the mantelpiece. The lamp on the table between them threw a warm circle of light. Outside, the Yorkshire dark was absolute and quiet. "I know," Caroline said softly. Not forgiving him. Not yet. Not accusing him. Simply confirming, yes. "I know. I knew." And somehow that small confirmation, the acknowledgement that she had understood exactly what was happening and had carried it alone, was the worst thing he had heard in 2 days of bad things. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "I want to tell you that I do, but I don't. I know what I did wrong. I don't yet know how to become the kind of man who wouldn't have done it." She looked at him for a long time. The steadiness in her face didn't soften exactly, but something in it shifted the way a door doesn't open but stops being locked. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing you have said to me in 11 years. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Around them, Pembroke Manor breathed its old patient breath, the creak of the timbers, the wind off the moors, the distant sound of the household settling into its evening rhythms. All of it still running, still whole, because of the woman sitting across from him, who had decided 6 months ago that she would not let it fall. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," he said, "or to trust me. I'm asking—" He stopped. "I'm only asking you not to have decided yet." Caroline looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Go get some rest, Frederick," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." It was not a yes. It was not even close to a yes. But she had used his name, and that he decided as he rose from the chair and walked back out into the hallway of his ancestral home would have to be enough for tonight. I used his name. That was what Frederick kept returning to as he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom. Not Lord Pembroke. Not the careful, courteous distance she had maintained since the moment he walked through the front door. She had said Frederick, and then she had told him to rest, and he had walked out of that library feeling something he could not immediately identify. It took him until nearly 2 in the morning to name it. Hope. That was dangerous. He knew it was dangerous. A man who had done what he had done, left his wife alone for 6 months, ignored her letters, returned with another woman on his arm, failed to see the fraud being conducted under his own roof until his wife handed him the evidence. A man like that had no business feeling hope after a single use of his given name. But there it was. He slept badly and woke early again. It was becoming a habit, this waking before dawn. He wasn't sure whether it was guilt or urgency, or some new and uncomfortable species of responsibility pushing him out of sleep. Whatever it was, it got him downstairs before 6, and this time when he passed the estate office, the lamp was already lit, and Caroline was already at her desk, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway with an expression that was not warm exactly, but open, watchful, as if she had not yet decided what kind of morning this would be. "You're early again," she said. "Apparently." He came in. He sat in the hard chair without being invited this time, which felt like progress of a small and fragile kind. "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." "The tenants. The people on the home farm. The ones Hendricks shorted on wages." He had been thinking about them since London. "Have you met them, spoken with them?" She studied him. "Yes." "Tell me about them." Something shifted in her expression. "Why? Because I've lived on this land for 36 years, and I realize I couldn't tell you most of their names." He said it flatly without drama, because it was a fact, and because dressing it up would make it worse. "I want to understand what you did. I don't mean the ledgers. I mean what it meant to them." Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her pen. "The Marsh family," she began, "have been on the North Farm for 3 generations. William Marsh is 61 years old. He's been working the same field since he was 12. Hendricks had been shorting his weekly wages by 4 shillings for 14 months. She paused. "When I told him I was returning the money, he didn't say anything. He just stood there in the doorway of his cottage, and he looked at me like he couldn't quite believe I was real." Frederick said nothing. "He took off his hat." Caroline continued, her voice quiet. "He held it against his chest, and he thanked me. And then he went back inside and closed the door, and I stood on his doorstep for a moment before I walked back to the carriage, and I thought—" She stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought that I had been living in that house for 11 years, and I had never once knocked on that door." The estate office was very still. "Neither had I," Frederick said. "No." He let that sit between them without trying to explain it away, or diminish it, or rush past it toward something more comfortable. It needed to sit there. It was true, and it was heavy, and pretending it wasn't either of those things would be exactly the kind of thing the man he was trying to stop being would do. "How many families?" he asked. "On the home farm 11. On the tenant farms further out, another 7 who were affected indirectly by the harvest problems. She pulled a sheet from the side of her desk. I've written it all down. Names, amounts, what was owed and what was repaid. If you want to go through it. I want to go through it. She handed him the sheet. They spent the next 2 hours going through it together. Not the formal ledgers, those he had already reviewed. The human record. The names, the histories, the specific quiet catastrophes that 4 shillings a week, short sustained over 14 months, produces in a family living on the edge of subsistence. The Marsh family's youngest daughter had not had proper winter shoes. The Cooper's eldest son had been unable to take the apprenticeship he'd been offered because they couldn't spare his earnings. Small things. Enormous things. Frederick did not say much. He asked questions practical and specific, and Caroline answered them the same way. But somewhere in the second hour, she said something that stopped him entirely. There was a woman, Margaret Tilson. Her husband works the East Field. She came to the house in April. She walked 3 miles in the rain because she had heard that I was looking into the wage accounts. Caroline's voice was careful. Level. She had been saving what little she could manage for 2 years. She'd hidden it in a jar under the kitchen floor. A pause. She brought the jar with her. She thought she had been told, I think, that she was going to lose the tenancy, that the estate was in financial trouble, and they would all be turned out. Frederick looked up from the list. Hendricks told her that, not directly, but it seems he let the impression circulate. It would have kept people from asking too many questions about the accounts. Caroline's hands were still on the desk, perfectly still. She walked in carrying this jar. She put it on my desk. She said she had 23 shillings and that she was offering it as a gesture of good faith because she didn't know where else to turn. The silence had a different quality now. She brought you her savings, Frederick said. Yes. Because she was afraid of being turned out. Yes. And you? I gave her back her 23 shillings. I told her the tenancy was secure, that the problems were being addressed, and that nothing was going to happen to her family's home. Caroline met his eyes directly. And then I sat with her for half an hour while she cried because she had been frightened for 2 years, and no one had thought to tell her she didn't need to be. Frederick set the list down. He looked at his wife. At the woman who had walked up to doors he had never knocked on, who had sat with frightened people. He had never noticed. Being frightened, who had taken a jar of 23 shillings from a woman's shaking hands and handed it back and then stayed to bear witness to her relief. I thought about what he had been doing in April. The specific week of April, when Caroline was sitting with Margaret Tilson and her jar of savings. He tried to remember and found he could not fix on any particular moment. One party blurred into another one, dinner into the next. Isabella's drawing room, Ashfield's club, the comfortable frictionless passage of days that cost him nothing and left no mark. I have to ask you something, he said, and his voice came out different than he'd intended, rougher, less controlled. Ask. Was there ever a moment, any moment in the past 6 months when you considered simply leaving? He chose the word carefully, then abandoned the care. Not managing it, not protecting it, just leaving it to fail, leaving me to come home to a disaster of my own making. Caroline looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said. I had not expected the directness of it. In June, she continued, when I had the documents about Vane and the consortium, and I understood the full scope of what was happening, and I understood that you were in London with his sister, and that you had not opened my letters. She paused. I sat in this room one evening, and I thought very seriously about writing to my cousin in Lincolnshire and asking whether I could come to stay. But you didn't? No. Why not? She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking, choosing precision over speed. Because by that point it wasn't about you anymore. She looked at him steadily. Margaret Tilson had brought me her jar of savings. William Marsh had stood in his doorway and looked at me as though he couldn't believe I was real. There were 11 families on this land who needed someone to be consistent and reliable and present, and I was the only person in a position to be those things. A pause. Leaving would have been about my feelings. Staying was about something larger than my feelings. Frederick stared at his desk. at the list of names in Caroline's handwriting. "I am beginning to understand," he said slowly, "that you are a considerably better person than I am. That's not the point. It might be part of it." "The point," Caroline said with a firmness that was not unkind, "is that neither of us was fully seen in this marriage. I became invisible to you through habit and comfort. You became—" She stopped. "What did I become?" She chose the word carefully. "Decorative," she said. "To yourself, I mean. You became the Earl of Pembroke, the title, the name. You forgot to be a person, Frederick, and the trouble with forgetting to be a person is that eventually the people who needed you to be one simply stop expecting it of you. And when they stop expecting it, they stop needing you. And when they stop needing you, they stop waiting," he finished. "Yes." Gerald Vane's written withdrawal arrived 3 days later, just as Frederick's solicitor had demanded. It was formal, complete, and deeply unsatisfying in the way that legal documents always are, all the damage and the deceit compressed into bloodless procedural language. Frederick read it in the library, signed the acknowledgement his solicitor required, and felt approximately nothing. He had expected to feel relief or triumph, or at least the satisfaction of a concluded business. He felt none of those things, because the legal resolution of Gerald Vane's scheme had almost nothing to do with what was actually wrong, and Frederick was no longer capable of pretending otherwise. He put the document in the drawer and went to find Thomas Gray. "I want to go to the farms," he said. "Today, all of them." Thomas Gray looked at him with the expression of a man who has seen many things in 53 years and is making a visible effort not to show what he thinks about this one. "All of the tenant farms, my lord. And the home farm, starting with the home farm." A pause. "Very good, my lord. I'll have the horses ready within the hour." "Don't bother with the horses. We'll walk." Thomas Gray's expression did not change. "As you wish, my lord." They walked. It was a cold morning, the ground iron hard, and the sky low and gray, and Frederick put his head down against the wind coming off the moors and walked through fields he had ridden over hundreds of times without ever stopping. They started with the Marsh farm. William Marsh was in the yard when they arrived. He was a big man weathered to the color of old oak, with hands that looked like they'd been carved rather than grown. He saw Frederick coming, and he went very still, the way people do when they're trying to work out whether something is good news or bad news. Frederick stopped in front of him. "Mr. Marsh." William Marsh inclined his head. "My lord, Lady Pembroke told me what Hendricks did, the wages." Frederick said it plainly without preamble. "I'm sorry it happened. I should have known sooner." William Marsh looked at him steadily. He didn't say it's all right, which was the correct response, and would have required him to lie. "Her ladyship put it right," he said carefully. "She did. I know that." Frederick met the older man's gaze. "I want you to know that the oversight of these farms is going to change. I'm going to be here. Not just for the accounts here. If something is wrong, I want to know about it directly." A long silence. William Marsh's expression did something complicated and then settled. "That would be appreciated, my lord." It was not warm. It was not forgiveness. What was there to forgive? Marsh wasn't owed Frederick's penitence. He was owed competent stewardship, and he had not been getting it. The fact that Frederick was now proposing to provide it was the bare minimum of what should have been happening all along. But the man gave a small nod, and Frederick took it for what it was. They went to all 11 farms that day. At each one, Frederick introduced himself as though meeting these people for the first time, which in any meaningful sense he was. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions. He did not offer explanations of his absence, because explanations were a form of asking people to make him feel better about his own failures, and that was not what any of these people needed from him. It was past 4 in the afternoon when they returned to the manor. Frederick was cold to the bone, and his boots were covered in mud, and he had the particular tiredness that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from sustained attention, from the effort of actually seeing people for several hours, when you've spent years practicing the art of looking without seeing. Thomas Gray walked beside him in the particular silence of a man who has decided something. "You want to say something?" Frederick said. No, my lord. Gray. A pause. Lady Pembroke did all of this in July, my lord, on horseback in the rain in a single day. Frederick absorbed this. She did, he said. I thought you should know. I know. He kept walking. I'm beginning to understand the full inventory of things I should know, Gray. It's an extensive list. That evening, he found Caroline in the sitting room adjacent to the master bedroom. Her room, the room she'd always retreated to. The room he was beginning to understand she'd retreated to partly because it was the only space in the house that had ever been fully hers. She was at her desk, but not writing. She had a letter open in front of her, and she was simply looking at it, which was unusual enough to notice. Something wrong? He asked from the doorway. She looked up. Come in. She waited until he'd sat before she spoke again. I've had a letter from my mother. Frederick knew enough to be careful here. Caroline's relationship with her mother was not warm. Her family, the Wentworths, a minor Norfolk gentry line that had fallen on hard times before Caroline's marriage, had viewed the match with an earl as a financial rescue, and Caroline's mother had never fully distinguished between her daughter's value as a person and her daughter's value as a strategic alliance. It had been, he knew, a source of quiet pain that Caroline never discussed. She's heard about Isabella Vane, Caroline said. Through Lady Ashfield, apparently, who heard it from... She gave a small, controlled exhale. It doesn't matter the chain. The point is that my mother knows, and she has written to inform me that I have handled the situation incorrectly. How so? I should have made more noise. Caroline's voice was precise and careful in the way it got when she was managing something she genuinely felt. I should have written to her immediately. I should have engaged the sympathy of several named parties. I should have made my suffering visible so that my position would be clear. She set the letter down. She feels that my composure has made it look as though I don't mind. Frederick looked at his wife. At the controlled set of her mouth, the slight tension around her eyes, the way she was holding herself very straight in her chair. Do you mind? He asked. She looked at him directly. Of course I mind. Tell me what it was actually like. He said it quietly. Not the ledgers, not the legal strategy. What it was actually like those 6 months. For a moment she said nothing. Then something in her face changed, not dramatically, not with the collapse of composure, but with the small, careful opening of a door that had been closed for a long time. The first month was the worst, she said. April. Because in April I still thought... She stopped. I had written to you. I thought the letters had perhaps been delayed or lost. I told myself that. I told myself that for 3 weeks. Frederick felt the weight of this with a precision that no self-inflicted reproach had yet produced. And then I stopped telling myself that, Caroline continued. And I was angry. Very angry for about 2 weeks. I was angry in that particular way that has nowhere to go, because being angry at someone who isn't there is rather like speaking into a room where all the sound just disappears. And after the anger, I decided that being angry was a luxury I couldn't afford. She looked at the letter from her mother, then looked away from it. Fenner had come. I had the accounts to investigate. Margaret Tilson hadn't yet come with her jar, but I already knew there were problems, and problems do not wait for one's emotional convenience. A pause. So I worked. And working was better than being angry. Considerably better. Caroline. She looked at him. I'm not asking because I need to understand the timeline, he said. I'm asking because for 11 years, I never asked you what anything was actually like for you, and I'd like to stop being that person. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was lower. There were evenings, she said, when I was very tired, and the house was very quiet, and I sat here at this desk, and I thought, what is the point? She looked at her hands. Not dramatically, just clearly, very simply. What is the point of all of this? Of being excellent at things that no one sees, of managing and protecting and sustaining a life that the person I'm supposed to share it with has simply walked away from. The room was very still. And what did you answer yourself? Frederick asked. William Marsh, she said. And Margaret Tilson, and the 11 families. She looked up. And myself, eventually. I answered myself. What do you mean? I mean that in the process of deciding that I would not fall apart. She paused, and something that might almost have been wry crossed her face. I discovered that I was rather more than I had been told I was. Or rather, that I had been rather less than I was capable of for quite some time. She had been less, because he had needed her to be less. Not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way that a person whose needs are always being anticipated and accommodated never develops the capacity to accommodate their own, and so the person doing the anticipating slowly, invisibly, makes themselves smaller to fit around them. He had made his wife small, without ever meaning to, without ever noticing. I'm sorry, he said. Not I'm sorry that this happened. Not I'm sorry you had to go through that. Just I'm sorry. The full, plain, unqualified thing. Caroline looked at him for a long time. I know, she said. And then before the moment could become something else, before it could calcify into premature resolution or false comfort. She picked up her mother's letter again and looked at it with an expression of tired but genuine amusement. She also says, Caroline continued, that I should have refused to receive Isabella Vane in the house at all. Frederick looked at his wife. What do you think about that? I think that refusing to receive her would have told you nothing useful about who she is or what she came here for. A small, sharp pause. Watching her be received with perfect courtesy, while everything she expected to find here was conspicuously absent, that told you considerably more. Frederick stared at her. Then, for the first time since he had come home, for possibly the first time in years, he laughed. A short, genuine, involuntary thing. You intended that, he said, from the beginning. I intended to behave correctly, Caroline said with the particular precision of a woman who knows exactly what she's saying. Behavior that is both correct and strategically informative is simply efficient. He looked at his wife. This woman he had underestimated, overlooked, taken for granted, failed to see, and felt something shift in his chest that was not quite guilt, and not quite admiration, and not quite grief, but held something of all three. You are formidable, he said. Yes. Caroline agreed without vanity and without false modesty. I am. I spent 6 months finding that out. Ending. The clock ticked. The lamp burned. Outside, the Yorkshire dark had settled fully over the moors, and Pembroke Manor sat quiet and solid in the middle of it, still standing, still whole, because of the woman at the desk who had decided it would be. There's something else, Caroline said, and the slight shift in her tone made him pay a different kind of attention. Tell me. Something I haven't told you yet. Something I found in August. She opened the left drawer of her desk, not the center drawer, where the Vane documents had been. The left one. The one he had not yet seen opened. I debated whether to tell you at all. I've been debating it since you came home. She placed something on the desk. A single letter older looking than the consortium papers, the paper heavier, the handwriting different. She placed it face down at first, then turned it. Frederick leaned forward and read the name on the outside. The letter was addressed to Gerald Vane. But the handwriting was not Gerald Vane's. The handwriting on the cover in the corner where a sender's name might appear belonged to a hand Frederick recognized, his own father's hand. He looked up at Caroline. Where did you get this? Fenner left it, she said quietly. When he came in March, he left it intentionally. I understood that later when I understood more about who he was working for. It was left on the hall table as he departed. I assumed at first it was accidental. And when you understood it wasn't accidental? When I read it. She met his eyes steadily. Frederick, your father knew the Vane family, knew them well. This letter is dated 1809. It describes an arrangement, a financial arrangement between your father and Gerald Vane's father regarding a debt. Frederick picked up the letter. He read it. He read it twice. The debt described in the letter was not small. It was in fact enormous, the kind of number that explained certain things about the late Earl of Pembroke's final years that Frederick had always attributed to bad luck and poor harvests. The arrangement described in the letter involved not just money, but something else, a promise. A future consideration. Something that the letter described with deliberate vagueness, but that a careful reader could interpret only one way: mineral rights. His father had promised the Vane family a first consideration on Pembroke mineral rights in exchange for relief on a personal debt. Not a legal document, just a gentleman's agreement. Just a letter. Just the kind of thing that in the right hands could be used to make a claim look more legitimate than it was. Fenner left this deliberately, Frederick said slowly. As a suggestion. As a foundation. If the consortium ever needed to argue that the Vane family had a prior claim, it would never hold legally, Caroline said. Mr. Whitmore confirmed that. A private letter of this kind with this level of vagueness is not a legal instrument, but in the court of public opinion among the right people presented correctly, it would have been embarrassing. He set the letter down. For the estate. For the family name. He looked at her. That's why they thought they could move slowly. They weren't just trying to steal the mineral rights. They were in a position from which they could pressure, negotiate, Caroline said. From strength. Yes, that's what I understood in August. Frederick stood up. He walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, working through the implications. His father. A debt. A careless promise written down and kept for 9 years by a family waiting for the right moment to use it. Did you tell Whitmore about this letter? Yes. He advised that it should be kept secure, and that if the Vanes attempted to use it, he could counter it effectively. She paused. He also advised that it would be prudent to address your father's original debt formally, so that there was no residual moral claim. Is there a residual debt? The original sum has been long since written off by the Vane estate. I confirmed it. She looked at him steadily. But the letter exists. And people like the Vanes don't destroy useful things. Frederick stared at the letter, at his father's handwriting, at the careful, old-fashioned script of a man who had been in Frederick's memory proud and capable and in command of everything around him. He was in trouble, Frederick said quietly. My father, at the end. It appears so. And he didn't tell me. No. He found his own way to manage it, and made it worse in the managing. Caroline said nothing. But he heard in her silence a recognition so complete and so delicate that naming it aloud would have broken it. Like father, like son. Both of them making private arrangements, private decisions, private failures, convinced that managing something meant hiding the difficulty of it from the people who needed to know. I've been doing the same thing, he said, my whole life. Managing the appearance of things rather than the actual substance of them. Yes. Caroline said softly, not cruelly, simply truthfully. He turned to look at her. What do you need from me? Not what I intend to give you. Not my plan. What do you actually need? She was quiet for a moment. A long moment, the kind that meant she was taking the question seriously rather than answering reflexively. I need to trust you, she said finally. Not to trust your apologies. Not to trust your intentions. To trust you. What you do day to day. Over time. She looked at him directly. I can't give you that trust because you've asked for it, or because you've explained yourself, or because you've had a week of difficult realizations. Trust is built from evidence, Frederick. It requires time. I know. I want to trust you, she said, and that careful, precise phrasing. I want to was the most honest and most heartbreaking sentence he had heard from her. That matters. But wanting to want something is not the same as having it. He looked at his wife, at the lamp burning on her desk, at the letter from her mother, and the letter from his father's past, and the quiet evidence of everything she had done, and kept, and managed, and protected in the 6 months he had not been here. Then I'll give you time, he said. I'll give you evidence. I'll stay, and I'll work, and I'll be here. Actually here. A pause. And I won't ask you to decide anything before you're ready. Caroline looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once, small, careful, the nod of a woman who is not giving anything away yet, but who is perhaps beginning to keep a different kind of accounting. Go to bed, Frederick, she said. I went. Behind him, he heard the quiet sound of her pen uncapping, returning to her correspondence, to her work, to the ongoing management of a life she had rebuilt around herself while he was not watching. He paused in the doorway of the hall. Caroline. She looked up. "My father's letter," he said. "The one from Fenner. When did you decide not to destroy it?" A pause. "I never considered destroying it. Most people would have, given what it says about the family. Most people would have been deciding based on what was comfortable," she said simply. "I was deciding based on what was true. The truth is more useful than comfort. I thought you were beginning to understand that." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The lamp threw her shadow long and steady on the wall behind her. "I'm learning," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she looked back down at her desk. He walked out into the hallway of Pembroke Manor and stood still for a moment in the dark, listening to the old house breathe around him. Somewhere in the rooms above him, the people who depended on this place were settling into their nights. And in the room behind him, his wife was writing letters by lamplight, keeping records, managing truths, doing the invisible and essential and completely underestimated work that had kept everything standing. He had come home 6 months too late, but he was beginning to understand that late was not the same as never, and that the question was not whether he could earn what he had wasted. The question was whether he was willing to become the kind of man who deserved the chance to try. The thing about genuine change is that it does not announce itself. Frederick had half expected, in the way that men who have lived comfortable lives expect things, that deciding to be different would feel different. That waking up the morning after his conversation with Caroline about trust and evidence and time would produce some discernible shift in the atmosphere of the house, some small acknowledgement from the universe that he had understood something important and was now going to be rewarded for understanding it. The universe offered nothing of the kind. He woke up. The house was cold. The fires needed lighting. The accounts needed reviewing. Caroline was already at her desk. Everything was exactly the same as it had been the day before, except that Frederick Pembroke got up and went to work. Not the kind of work he had always done. The occasional signature, the quarterly review, the appearance of management that he had always confused with management itself. Real work. The kind that Caroline had been doing for 6 months. He sat with the new estate manager, a methodical man named Alderton, who had come with strong recommendations from a neighboring estate, and who looked at Frederick with the careful neutrality of a man who has heard about the previous state of affairs and is reserving judgment. Frederick did not try to impress Alderton. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. When he did not understand something, he said so directly, rather than nodding as though he did. Alderton, by the end of the first week, was looking at him with something that had shifted from cautious neutrality to cautious respect. It was not warm. Frederick did not expect warm. He had not earned warm yet. Caroline watched all of this. He knew she was watching, not obviously, not constantly, but with the same careful evidence-gathering attention she brought to everything. He did not perform for her benefit. He had decided that early in the first week, when he caught himself adjusting his behavior because he thought she might be observing it, and stopped and asked himself whether he would be doing the same thing if she weren't there. The answer that first time was no, so he had to start again. Do it again. Do it because it was right, not because it produced the result he wanted. The distinction was difficult in a way he had not anticipated. It was much easier to do the right thing when doing the right thing felt like a performance with an audience. Doing it quietly with no expectation of credit was a different skill entirely. He was learning it slowly. 3 weeks after his return, something happened that he had not anticipated. Howe was in the estate office, his own estate office, the one he had reclaimed from Alderton's preliminary use, where he had started keeping his own correspondence, when Thomas Gray appeared in the doorway with the particular expression that meant something had occurred that required careful handling. "My lord, there is a gentleman at the door." "Who?" "A Mr. Poole." A pause. "I believe he is known to your lordship in connection with the consortium matter." Frederick went still. "Poole, the man Caroline turned away in September." "The same, my lord. He is asking to speak with you directly. He says—" Thomas Gray cleared his throat with the delicacy of a man handling something distasteful. "He says he has new information, that he believes it will be of significant personal interest to your lordship." Frederick thought for exactly 2 seconds. "Send him to the library. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Then, almost as an afterthought, except that it was not an afterthought, it was a decision, and ask Lady Pembroke if she would be willing to join us. Thomas Gray's expression did not change, but there was some very small thing in the quality of his stillness that suggested Frederick had done something unexpected. "Of course, my lord." Frederick walked to the library. He arranged 2 chairs across from the one where Poole would sit. 2, not 1. He had just sat down when Caroline came in. She glanced at the chairs. She glanced at him. She sat down without saying anything, and the fact that she simply sat without asking why, without making him explain the gesture, told him she had understood it. Poole arrived 2 minutes later. He was a small, precise man, with the kind of face that had learned to look trustworthy and had not quite succeeded. He saw Caroline and did an almost imperceptible double-take that he suppressed very quickly. He had not expected her to be there. Good, Frederick thought. "Mr. Poole." Frederick did not offer his hand. "You said you have information." Poole sat. He placed a leather document case on his knee. "I appreciate you seeing me, Lord Pembroke. I want to say first that my involvement in the consortium was strictly professional. I was retained as an agent. I was not a principal." "Mr. Poole." Frederick's voice was flat. "The information." A pause. Poole opened the document case. "It concerns Miss Vane," he said. "Isabella Vane." Frederick felt rather than saw Caroline go very still beside him. "She has been in contact with the consortium since her departure from Pembroke Manor," Poole continued. "She approached us independently. She proposed a new arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Poole extracted a single sheet from the case and placed it on the table between them. "She has offered to provide testimony in writing, legally witnessed, regarding certain representations she believes were made to her by Lord Pembroke during their time in London. Representations, she claims, regarding the future disposition of the mineral rights." The silence in the library was absolute. Frederick looked at the sheet. It was a summary of Isabella's proposed testimony. He read it carefully, with the cold, complete attention of a man who has spent 3 weeks learning to look at things directly rather than away from them. When he finished, he set it down. "She is claiming," he said evenly, "that I promised her family a right of first acquisition. She is prepared to claim that, yes. That is a lie." "Yes, my lord. I rather suspected it might be." Poole's voice was careful. "Which is why I am here." Frederick looked at him. "You're here because you're separating yourself from a scheme that has become legally dangerous." Poole did not deny it. "I am here because I believe you should know what Miss Vane intends, and because the consortium's principles—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Because I do not wish to be party to a fabricated legal claim." "How noble," Caroline said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a very sharp thing wrapped carefully. "And what do you want in exchange for this information?" "Mr. Poole." Poole looked at her. "A written assurance that Lord Pembroke will not pursue legal action against me personally." "That," Frederick said, "will depend entirely on what else you tell us." Poole told them everything. It took 40 minutes. By the end of it, Frederick had a complete picture of the consortium's strategy, the timeline of their approach to Hendricks, the full scope of what they had intended, and most importantly, the specific details of what Isabella Vane had agreed to do. She had agreed to provide false testimony in exchange for 20% of the value of any mineral rights acquisition. 20%. She had negotiated it herself, apparently, and had negotiated it well. The consortium solicitor had been, according to Poole, somewhat impressed by her. When Poole left with Frederick's conditional assurance contingent on his written deposition, which he agreed to provide within 48 hours, the library was very quiet. Caroline picked up the summary sheet that Poole had left on the table. She read it again slowly. "She was always going to do this," Frederick said. Not with anger, with the exhausted recognition of a man who has understood something he should have understood sooner. If the direct approach failed, this was the fallback. Use me as the instrument. Claim I made promises. Yes, my father's letter was the foundation. Her testimony was supposed to be the structure built on it. He looked at his wife. A letter suggesting a prior family arrangement corroborated by a woman who claims the current Earl confirmed it personally. Taken together even without legal weight, it would have been enough to create public pressure, Caroline finished, and enough uncertainty to make a settlement seem preferable to a prolonged dispute. How long have you known she might do this? Caroline set the paper down. I suspected it in August when I understood the full strategy. A scheme of this complexity doesn't end simply because one approach fails. It adapts. You didn't tell me. You'd been home for 3 days when Poole arrived just now. I was waiting to see whether he would come. She looked at him directly. He came faster than I expected. Frederick absorbed this. Then, what do we do? The word "we" was not lost on either of them. He heard himself say it and did not take it back. Neither did Caroline. We act first, she said. Before she can file anything formal. Your solicitors need to know today. Poole's deposition needs to be secured immediately before anyone has the chance to convince him it's not in his interest to give it. She was already thinking through it. He could see it, the quick, precise movement behind her eyes. And we need to address the social dimension. Meaning that Isabella Vane has been in London for 3 weeks talking to people. I don't know exactly what she's been saying, but I can guess its general character. She looked at him steadily. There will be a version of this story circulating in certain drawing rooms that positions her as the wronged party. She wasn't. I know that. You know that. But she is charming, and she is connected, and she has had 3 weeks head start. A pause. We need to appear publicly. Together. And we need to do it before she files anything, so that any testimony she subsequently offers looks like what it is, retaliation, not truth. Frederick looked at his wife. You want to go to London. I want us to go to London, she corrected. Together. And I want you to be exactly who you have been for the past 3 weeks. She held his gaze. Not performing, not managing the appearance of things, just present and real, and clearly aligned with this estate and with me. The word "me" sat in the air between them. She had not said with your wife. She had said with me. It was personal in a way that suggested she was beginning very carefully to be willing to make it personal. When? Frederick asked. Friday, Caroline said. The Harrington dinner. Lady Harrington invited me in September. I declined. I'll write today and accept. She rose from her chair. It's the right room, the right people, and Lady Harrington has never liked the Vane family. Frederick looked at his wife standing in his library. Her library. Really. The room she had managed and organized and used while he was gone, and felt something that was becoming familiar, the combination of profound admiration and equally profound inadequacy. The admiration was straightforward. The inadequacy was more complicated. It was not the old, comfortable inadequacy of a man who knew he should do better and chose not to. It was the inadequacy of a man who was genuinely trying and understood with new and humbling clarity how far he still had to go. Caroline, he said. She paused at the door. The night I came home. When you were standing on the staircase. He looked at her. Were you frightened? She was quiet for a moment. Yes. You didn't look it. No. A small pause. I decided the night before you arrived, Thomas had sent word that your carriage had been seen at Leeds. I decided that I would not let you see me frightened. Not because I wanted to punish you or make a point, but because... She stopped choosing the word. Because I had spent 6 months becoming someone I respected. And I didn't want the first thing you saw when you came home to be someone who had collapsed back into who she used to be simply because you'd returned. Frederick held her gaze. Who did she used to be? Someone who organized herself entirely around the hope of being noticed, Caroline said quietly. Someone who made herself smaller and quieter and more convenient because she thought if I am easy enough to be with, he'll choose to be here. She looked at him with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who has worked through something difficult and arrived at the other side of it changed. I don't want to be that person again. I don't want you to be that person again, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once the same small, careful nod she had given him before, the one that gave nothing away yet, but refused nothing either. Friday, she said. I'll write to Lady Harrington today. She left. Frederick sat alone in the library for a moment. Then he reached for his own pen and began to write to his solicitors. The Harrington dinner was on a Friday evening in early November, and it was by the standards of the Yorkshire gentry social calendar significant. Lady Harrington was 71 years old and had the particular social authority of a woman who has outlived all her rivals and collected their secrets. Her dinners were attended carefully. Absences were noticed, and the composition of her table, who sat where, who was invited at all, was read by the county's social observers with the attentiveness of scholars studying primary sources. Frederick and Caroline arrived together. This was itself notable. The county had known in the way that counties always know the general outlines of what had occurred. The Earl's absence, the return with a companion, the companion's subsequent departure. The details were imprecise and the interpretations varied, but the broad shape of the story was understood. And so, when the Pembroke carriage arrived at Harrington Park, and both Lord and Lady Pembroke stepped out of it and walked up the front steps together, there was a small but perceptible recalibration in the rooms inside. Frederick felt it the moment they entered. The specific quality of attention, the conversations that paused slightly, the eyes that moved to them and then moved carefully away. He had been part of the social machinery of this county his entire life. He knew exactly how it worked. He also knew, walking through those doors beside his wife, that he had never in his marriage given the people in these rooms a reason to look at Caroline as someone whose standing mattered independently of his. She had always been an appendage, gracious, well-liked, entirely secondary. The woman beside the Earl. Tonight she was wearing dark green, simply cut with the small pearl earrings, and nothing else. She moved through the rooms with the ease of a person who is not performing confidence, but actually has it. And that ease, he noticed, turned heads in a different way than the old version of Caroline had turned heads. People who had always found her pleasant were finding her interesting. There was a quality about her that the past 6 months had produced that was difficult to name, but immediately recognizable, the quality of a person who has been tested by something real and come through it, knowing exactly who they are. Lady Harrington found them within minutes. She was a small woman of formidable energy who moved through her own rooms like a ship through familiar water. Purposeful, assured, operating with the proprietary ease of a person whose territory is entirely clear. Lady Pembroke. She took Caroline's hands. "I'm so glad you came. I had begun to think Yorkshire had lost you entirely." "Not at all," Caroline said warmly. "I've been rather busy at home." "So I hear." Lady Harrington's eyes were sharp and kind in equal measure. She glanced at Frederick with an assessment that was over in a single second and somehow comprehensive. "Lord Pembroke." "Lady Harrington." He inclined his head. "Thank you for the invitation." "You look," she said, "as though you've been working." "I have been." She studied him for another second. Then she made a small sound that was not quite approval, but was in that direction. "Come. There are people I want Caroline to meet. There's a woman here from Derbyshire who has been doing extraordinary things with the management of her late husband's estate. I think they'll have a great deal to say to each other." She swept Caroline away with the comfortable authority of a woman who has been directing social traffic for 50 years. Frederick watched his wife move through the room beside Lady Harrington and felt the distinctive sensation of watching someone come into focus. The sense that you are seeing a thing properly, perhaps for the first time, after years of looking at it in insufficient light. Lord Ashfield appeared at his elbow. This was less welcome. Ashfield was the man at whose party Frederick had first met Isabella Vane, a connection that now sat in Frederick's memory with the specific discomfort of a thing you wish you could revise. "Pembroke." Ashfield's voice was careful. "Good to see you." "Ashfield." A pause. The kind of pause in which two men establish, without speaking, the exact nature of what they are going to say to each other. "I heard you were back at Pembroke," Ashfield said, "several weeks ago, and settling in, I take it." "Yes." Frederick looked at him directly. "I've been working with the new estate manager, walking the farms, reviewing the accounts." He paused for one deliberate beat. "My wife has done a remarkable amount in my absence. I've been working to understand the full extent of it, Ashfield's expression shifted, subtle but readable. He had expected something more defensive, something more eager to paper over the obvious. He had not expected Frederick to speak plainly. "The Vane business," Ashfield said carefully, "has been addressed. Gerald has been there is talk in London Pembroke, regarding certain claims. There will be a formal response to any claims," Frederick said. "From my solicitors within the week. I expect the claims will not survive contact with the actual documentation." He looked at Ashfield with the calm that comes from having done the work. Not performed calm, actual calm. The calm of a man who knows exactly what he knows. Isabella Vane made choices. Her brother made choices. The consequences of those choices are being addressed through the appropriate channels. Ashfield was quiet for a moment. Then, "And Lady Pembroke has been handling Pembroke Manor with a competence that I find frankly instructive." He said it without irony, without hedge, in a room full of people who were listening with the particular practiced attentiveness of a social class that depends on what is and isn't said. "She discovered fraud in our estate management, protected our accounts, negotiated to save the harvest, and managed a legal threat that I was not present to handle. I returned to a better managed estate than I left." The silence around them had that particular quality of held breath. "Good God," Ashfield said quietly. "Yes," Frederick agreed. "My reaction was similar." He moved away from Ashfield and went to find his wife. She was in conversation with the woman from Derbyshire, a Mrs. Alderton, energetic and direct, who was gesturing with the animation of someone who has found a kindred listener, and she did not stop the conversation when Frederick approached. She acknowledged him with a slight turn of her shoulder, an inclusion without interruption, and he stepped into the conversation without making it about himself. He listened. He asked a question. Mrs. Alderton answered it and turned to Caroline to continue, and Caroline answered, and then turned to him, and the conversation moved between the three of them with the natural ease of people who are all genuinely interested in the same subject. Frederick could not remember the last time he had been in a social conversation with his wife where he was not the center of it. He found it to his own surprise considerably more interesting. Later, when they were preparing to leave, Lady Harrington found them again. She was brief and direct in the way of women who have no remaining patience for anything else. "Lady Pembroke," she said, "I want you on the committee for the Tenant Welfare Fund. We are reorganizing it in January. Your method's what you did with the Pembroke Home Farm wages. I've been hearing about it for weeks. I need that kind of thinking." Caroline looked genuinely surprised. Not the performed surprise of a woman pretending to be modest, but the real thing. "I would be honored," she said. Lady Harrington turned to Frederick. "You," she said simply, "are learning." "I am trying to," he said. "Trying to," she repeated. "That is more than most of them manage." She walked away. In the carriage back to Pembroke Manor, they were quiet for a while. Not the careful, managed quiet of the past several weeks, the quiet of two people who have been in the same place for an evening and are comfortable enough not to fill the silence with noise. Then Caroline said, "Ashfield will talk." "He's already talking," Frederick said, "but he'll talk differently now than he would have an hour ago." She considered this. "You were very direct with him. I've been very direct with everyone tonight." He looked at her in the dark of the carriage. "It is, I find, considerably less exhausting than the alternative." She almost smiled. "Yes, it is." Caroline. He had been carrying something since the library, since Poole's visit, since the moment he had heard what Isabella was prepared to do. "I need to say something about Isabella." She turned to look at him. "She made choices," he said. "I know that. But I made it easy for her to make them. I was convenient. I was distracted and comfortable, and exactly the kind of man who could be managed without noticing he was being managed." He looked at his wife. "The fault is not equal. What she did was deliberate deception, and mine was negligence. But both of those things were necessary for any of it to work." Caroline was quiet. "I'm not telling you this to argue for her," he said. "I'm telling you because I need you to know that I understand my part in it. Not just the affair, the whole of it. I created conditions in which this kind of thing could happen, and I did that because I was comfortable, and I didn't think I needed to pay attention." "I know," she said softly. I know you know. He looked out the window at the dark moors rolling past. I needed to say it anyway. The carriage moved through the November night. Inside it, two people sat close enough that the cold was less noticeable, and neither of them moved away. When they arrived at Pembroke Manor, Frederick stepped down first and offered his hand to help Caroline descend. This was correct conventional, the thing a gentleman always did. But she took his hand and held it for one moment longer than the descent required. Just one moment. Then she let go and walked up the front steps. Frederick stood on the gravel drive for that moment, feeling the cold where her hand had been. He went inside. The solicitor's letter arrived the following Tuesday. Frederick was in the estate office when it came, and he read it standing up because something in the weight of the envelope told him to be braced. Isabella Vane had moved faster than Poole had suggested she would. She had already submitted a formal statement to a London solicitor, not yet a legal filing, but a notarized statement of her claimed testimony. She had also, the solicitor's letter informed him with the careful understatement of a man conveying alarming news professionally spoken to two journalists. Not the respectable press. The other kind. Frederick read the letter twice. He set it down. He walked directly to Caroline's sitting room. She read it without expression. When she finished, she set it on her desk with the particular care she gave to things that required careful handling. "She's accelerating," Frederick said, "because Poole came to us." Caroline's voice was even. "She knows we know, and she's decided that offense is better than defense. What can we do? We file first." She looked up at him. "Not a counterclaim, something else." She paused. "My father's old solicitor in Lincolnshire, I wrote to him in October about the legal framework around Hendricks and the consortium. In the course of that correspondence, he mentioned something I've been thinking about since." Frederick waited. "He mentioned a public declaration of estate accounts," Caroline said. "A voluntary disclosure. Everything, the fraud, the consortium, the remedies. All of it presented formally to the estate's creditors, tenants, and the local magistrate." She looked at him directly. "Not because we're required to. Because if we do it first voluntarily before anyone can claim we're hiding something, it establishes the truth of events so completely and so publicly that anything Isabella offers looks like what it is. A public accounting," Frederick said slowly. "Publicly defended accounts tell only one story," Caroline said. "Everyone sees who managed what and when and how. Everyone sees what Hendricks did and how it was discovered and what was done about it. Everyone sees what the consortium attempted and how it was stopped." Her eyes held his. "And everyone sees who was actually running Pembroke Manor for 6 months." He understood what she was offering. Not to him, not as a gift, not as forgiveness. She was offering the truth. The full, unambiguous, publicly documented truth of what had happened, including the parts that reflected badly on him. She was willing to do that, to put herself and her work into a public record, even knowing that the same record would document his absence and his failure, because the truth was more useful than any version of events that protected either of their reputations at the cost of accuracy. "When you said you never considered destroying my father's letter," he said, "this is why. Part of why." She met his gaze without flinching. "Truth has a structure to it. You can't pick which parts of it you want to keep." Frederick looked at his wife for a long moment. The lamp on her desk burned steadily. Somewhere in the house a door closed, and the sound moved through the old walls like a breath. "I want to do this with you," he said. Not have you prepare it and present it to me to sign. With you. Together." She looked at him. Something in her face not softening exactly, but opening the way a window opens to let in air. "That will take considerably more of your time than signing a document," she said. "I know. It will require you to sit with accounts and correspondence and tenant records for Caroline." His voice was quiet. "I know. I want to." The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from the window, then steadied. "All right," she said. "We'll start tomorrow morning." He nodded. He turned to leave. "Frederick." He looked back. "At the Harrington dinner," she said. "When you told Ashfield about the estate, about what I had done." She paused. "Were you doing that strategically, or did you mean it?" I understood the question. She was not asking whether the result was useful, She was asking whether the truth of what he said about her had preceded the usefulness of saying it, or the other way around. "I meant it first," he said. "The strategy was secondary." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Good. Just that. Just the one word, quiet and certain, the kind of word that doesn't promise anything, but doesn't close anything either." He walked out of the sitting room and down the corridor of Pembroke Manor, and behind him he heard the soft, familiar scratch of her pen, resuming going back to the work. The endless, competent work that she had been doing all along. He went to the library and sat down at his own desk and opened the correspondence that had been waiting. He worked for 2 hours by lamplight, writing careful, precise letters to his solicitors, to the magistrate, to Lord Hargreaves, who had negotiated the harvest arrangement with Caroline and deserved to be properly thanked. He wrote the last letter by himself. It took him a long time to write, and he rewrote it twice, and when it was done, it was shorter than everything he felt, but more honest than any longer version would have been. It was to William Marsh. It thanked him for his patience. It informed him of the account discrepancy and its remedy in plain language without euphemism. It told him that the supervision of the home farm was being restructured, and that his input on the farming calendar was being solicited formally rather than assumed. At the bottom, Frederick wrote, "My wife speaks well of your family. I intend to come and hear your views directly as she did. I should have done this long ago." He signed it, sealed it, and set it with the others to be sent in the morning. Then he sat for a moment in the quiet library of his ancestral home, with the fire burning low and the correspondence done, and the truth of the past weeks settling around him like cold and necessary air, and he thought about what it meant to be present. Not present as a title or a name or a financial fact. Present as a person. The specific, costly, irreplaceable kind of presence that meant you were there when it was difficult, when nothing was resolved, when the account books were open and the outcome was uncertain, and the person across the desk from you needed you to stay. He had not been that person. He was trying to become him. He was beginning to understand, sitting in the dark, in the quiet, with the letters to William Marsh and the magistrate and his own solicitors stacked beside him, that trying was not enough, but that it was the only place to start. He blew out the lamp. He went upstairs. And for the first time since he had come home, he slept straight through until morning. The public accounting took 3 weeks to prepare. Frederick had not understood when he agreed to it exactly what 3 weeks of working alongside Caroline would feel like. He had imagined something: orderly documents, reviewed letters, drafted the satisfying progression of a task with a clear endpoint. What he had not imagined was the specific quality of sustained close attention that the work required. The way it meant sitting across from his wife for 4 and 5 hours at a stretch, going through records she had built from nothing while he was gone, understanding not just the financial facts, but the human architecture beneath them. Every entry in those books had a name behind it. Every corrected figure represented someone who had been wronged and someone who had made it right. And that someone, consistently, methodically, without recognition or assistance, was the woman sitting across the desk from him. By the end of the first week, Frederick had stopped thinking of the accounts as documents. He had started thinking of them as a portrait, a complete and unflinching portrait of who Caroline Wentworth Pembroke actually was, painted in the only medium she had available to her: action, quiet and persistent, when no one was watching. By the end of the second week, something had shifted between them. Not dramatically. Not with any declaration or acknowledged moment. It shifted the way the light shifts in November, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until you look up one afternoon and realize the quality of everything around you has changed. She stopped using Lord Pembroke entirely. She called him Frederick, and she did it without apparent decision, the way people slip back into old habits when their guard lowers. He noticed the first time it happened. He said nothing. He did not want to make her aware of it and cause her to reconsider. He brought her tea in the mornings. Not because it was strategic. He had learned over the past month to ask himself that question, and the answer was that he simply noticed she always had a cup when she arrived at the desk, and he could get there before she did. So he did. She looked at the cup. The first morning it appeared, then looked at him, then said nothing, and picked it up and kept working. By the third morning she said thank you without looking up. By the sixth, she had started leaving a cup for him. He did not point this out either. The formal public accounting was presented on a Tuesday morning in mid-November in the Great Hall of Pembroke Manor, to an assembled group that included the magistrate, the estate's principal creditors, 3 solicitors, and every tenant and laborer connected to the home farm and the tenant farms. Frederick had insisted on the last group. His solicitors had suggested it was unnecessary. Frederick had overruled them, which was itself a change significant enough that Thomas Gray had found a reason to be in the corridor outside the library when that particular conversation occurred. Caroline stood beside Frederick when the accounting was presented. Not behind him. Not to the side. Beside him in the dark green dress she had worn to Lady Harrington's dinner, and she was the one who walked the assembled group through the records because she was the one who knew them completely. Frederick watched the room as she spoke. He watched William Marsh standing at the back with his hat in his hands, listening to a woman explain clearly and without embarrassment exactly how the fraud had worked, exactly what had been stolen from him, and exactly how it had been remedied. He watched the old farmer's face, the careful, weathered dignity of a man who has spent his life being told implicitly that his concerns were secondary, register something that took Frederick a moment to name. He was being taken seriously, not pitied, not managed, taken seriously. Addressed as someone whose experience of events was a relevant fact in the public record of those events. When Caroline finished, she opened the floor for questions. This too was Frederick's suggestion, and this one had surprised his solicitors even more than the invitation to the tenants. Questions in Frederick's social world were managed, not invited. But he had been watching Caroline work for 3 weeks, and he had learned something from it. She invited questions because she was not afraid of the answers, and she was not afraid of the answers because she had done the work, and the work was honest. Several people had questions. Caroline answered all of them directly. When one of the creditors asked a question that touched on the period of Frederick's absence in a way that made the room go slightly quiet, Frederick answered it himself. "The estate was not under effective management during my absence," he said clearly. "That is a fact. The fraud that occurred was possible in part because of that gap in oversight. The person who identified the problem and addressed it was my wife. I want that understood clearly because it is true, and because she deserves the credit." The room was very still for a moment. Then William Marsh at the back did something. He put his hat back on, and then he took it off again in the old gesture of respect, the one he'd used when Caroline had stood at his cottage door. Deliberate, unhurried, seen. Caroline did not look at Frederick after he spoke, but the set of her shoulders changed just slightly, just enough. He had not done it for the effect. She knew he had not done it for the effect, and the knowing was everything. Isabella Vane's formal statement collapsed within a week of the public accounting. Not dramatically. Not with any public confrontation or legal battle. It simply became untenable in the face of a complete and documented public record. Her solicitor withdrew the statement quietly. The 2 journalists who had spoken with her found, when they looked at the Pembroke accounting, that there was no story of the kind they had been promised, only a story about a well-managed estate, a competent countess, and a fraud that had been caught and corrected. That story was less interesting to them than the one Isabella had offered. Poole's deposition was filed. Gerald Vane sent a second, more complete withdrawal, this one covering not just the mineral rights claim, but any derivative claims that might arise from his sister's testimony. Frederick's solicitor read it and said it was the most comprehensive surrender document he had seen in 20 years of practice. Frederick read it and felt nothing except a clean, uncomplicated relief that it was over. Howe was in the library when he read it. He went immediately to find Caroline. She was in the estate office going over the January budget projections with Alderton. Frederick waited in the doorway until Alderton gathered his papers and excused himself, and then he came in and placed Gerald's letter on the desk. She read it. She set it down. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pressed the heels of her hands against the edge of the desk, a small contained gesture, the kind of thing a person does when they have been holding something tightly for a very long time and are just beginning to let go. 6 months, she said. "And then some," he said quietly. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone who has carried a heavy thing a long distance and has just set it down. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I started all of this, the investigation, the accounts, the legal work, I told myself I was doing it for the estate, for the tenants, for everyone who depended on it." She paused. "And I was. That was true. But it was not the only truth." "What was the other truth?" "I was doing it for myself." She held his gaze directly the way she always did when she was being most precise. "I needed to know, I needed to find out whether I was actually capable of all of it. Not whether the estate could survive, whether I could." A breath. "I had spent 11 years being adequate, appropriate, fulfilling the function of a countess, and I had never once been asked or asked myself what I was actually capable of beyond that." Frederick looked at his wife. "What did you find out?" "That I am capable of considerably more than I knew." She said it without pride, without vanity, with the simple directness of a statement of fact. "And that finding that out even in the worst circumstances, even when I was frightened and alone and furious, was the most important thing that has ever happened to me." The estate office was very quiet. "I know," he said, "that this is not what you would have chosen. The circumstances, the reason you had to find it out." "No," she agreed. "It isn't what I would have chosen." "I'm sorry for that." "I know you are." She looked at him steadily. "I also know that I cannot. I refuse to be entirely sorry that it happened, because who I am now is someone I respect, and I did not fully respect who I was before." He understood what she was saying. She was not forgiving the circumstances. She was not retroactively endorsing his failure. She was doing something more complicated and more honest. She was holding two true things at once, the way only people who have thought carefully about difficult things can do. "I don't want you to go back to who you were before," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't want the countess who managed everything quietly and expected nothing. I want—" He stopped. "I want to be in a marriage where both people are fully present, where both people are seen." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her expression, not one thing, but several moving like weather across an open landscape. "That is what I want too," she said quietly. "I have wanted that for a long time." "I know. I should have known it before." "Yes," she agreed without softening it. "You should have." He held her gaze and did not look away from the plain truth of it. He did not flinch or explain or redirect. He simply let it be true, the way she had always let difficult things be true. She was watching him do it. He could see her watching. December came to Yorkshire, the way it always did, decisively with cold that had genuine intent behind it and mornings that were dark until nearly 8. Frederick was out with Alderton by 7 most days, and by the 3rd week of December, he knew every field on the Pembroke estate by name, and recent history knew which fences needed replacing. Before spring knew that the Cooper family's roof was weakening on the north side, and had arranged for it to be seen to before the worst of winter arrived. He wrote to William Marsh himself this time about the spring planting calendar. Marsh wrote back a short, careful letter, but a letter. It was the first correspondence between the Marsh family and the lord of the manor in 3 generations that had not been mediated through an estate manager. Frederick showed Caroline the letter. She read it and handed it back to him and said, "He writes well." That was all. But she was smiling slightly when she said it, and the smile reached her eyes, and he stored it away with the careful attention of a man who has learned to notice what he used to overlook. Lady Harrington's Tenant Welfare Committee met for the first time in mid-December. Caroline went. She came back 3 hours later with the particular energized quiet of a person who has spent time with people who recognize what they are worth. And she talked about the meeting over dinner, which was itself new. The talking at dinner. The actual exchange of two people's actual days. And Frederick asked questions, and she answered them, and they sat at the long dining table of Pembroke Manor for an hour after the meal was cleared talking. Just talking. About the committee, about the winter preparations, about a letter from his cousin in Edinburgh, about a book she was reading and hadn't thought he would find interesting and discovered mid-summery that he did. It was ordinary. Ordinary in the specific, unremarkable, deeply human way that had been entirely absent from their marriage for years. The ordinariness of two people who are actually present with each other, sharing the small and unglamorous fabric of a day. Frederick did not know how to say what that felt like without it sounding inadequate, so he did not say it. He simply stayed at the table and listened and talked and let the ordinary thing be ordinary. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear, with stars sharp enough to cut, and Pembroke Manor was lit in every room for the first time in years. Not for a party, just because Caroline had said that morning over the tea, they still brought each other, that she thought the house deserved to be bright on the last night of the year. Frederick had agreed immediately. They were in the library after dinner, when she asked him something she had been carrying for a while. He could tell it was that kind of question by the quality of the pause before it, the particular pause of someone choosing their moment. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "After the first week, when it was clear I wasn't going to, when I didn't—" She chose the word carefully. "When I didn't receive you back immediately. Most men would have gone back to London," he said. "Yes, I thought about it." She waited. "In the second week," he said. "When I understood that this was not going to resolve quickly. When I understood that what I had done was the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean resolution. I thought very seriously about returning to London and letting time do whatever time does." He looked at her. "And then I went out to the farms, and I walked the north field where your drainage negotiation had saved the harvest. And I stood in that field, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought that for 36 years I had moved through my life taking things without earning them." He said it simply, the way he had learned to say difficult things since coming home. The title, the estate, the comfort of a wife who managed everything and asked for nothing. All of it received, never earned. And I thought— He paused. "I thought that if I left now, I would spend the rest of my life being exactly that person. Someone who walks away when being present costs something. And if you stayed— If I stayed, there was at least the possibility of becoming someone else." He looked at her directly. "I stayed because I did not want to be the man who left. Not to win you back. Not because I was certain you would, because I was not certain. I stayed because leaving was the most true and final confirmation of everything I had been doing wrong, and I was not willing to confirm it." Caroline was quiet for a long moment. "That," she said softly, "is the most honest thing you could have said. I know. Most men would have said they stayed for love. Most men," he said, "would have said it and not examined whether it was entirely true." He held her gaze. "I stayed because I could not face what leaving would make me. The love, the understanding of what I actually feel that has come in the staying. It was not there first. I think I owe you the honesty of that." She looked at him across the lamplight. Outside, somewhere distant, a bell was ringing the first stroke of the new year, coming in across the Yorkshire dark. Caroline rose from her chair. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him and looked up at him. This woman who had carried everything alone, who had built herself into someone new in the space of 6 months, who had looked at him on the staircase with pity and steadiness and refused to let him see her frightened. She put her hand against his face. Just her hand, gently, the way you touch something you have decided to trust again. "I know you stayed," she said quietly. "I watched you stay. Every morning. Every time it would have been easier to stop." Her eyes held his. "That is what trust is made of, Frederick. Not words. That." He covered her hand with his own. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would be more true than the silence. She did not move away. Outside, the bell finished its count. The new year was in 1819, cold and certain and entirely open. Inside Pembroke Manor, in the library, where the accounts had been reviewed and the truth had been stated, and the long necessary work of becoming had been undertaken. Two people stood together in the lamplight, neither of them the person they had been 12 months ago. The story that circulated through Yorkshire in the months that followed, through the drawing rooms of Harrington Park, through the tenant farms, through the careful social memory of a county that kept its own records, was not quite accurate, the way stories rarely are. People said that Lord Pembroke had gone to London, come to his senses, and come home to win back his wife. That was not what happened. What happened was more complicated and less comfortable, and entirely more true. What happened was that a woman decided alone, and without assistance, that she would not fall apart. And in not falling apart, discovered that she was formidable. And what happened was that a man came home expecting to find someone waiting and found instead someone who had moved on without moving out, who had built a life of genuine competence and genuine worth in the space his absence had created. And what happened then, the thing that did not make it into the drawing room version, was work. Quiet, sustained, unglamorous work. Morning after morning of tea brought and received. Field after field walked in November mud. Account after account reviewed together. Question after question asked and answered honestly, including the ones that were difficult to ask and more difficult to answer. There was no single moment when Caroline decided to trust him again. Trust does not work that way. It accumulated slowly. The way interest accumulates, the way a wall is built, stone by stone. Each one placed by a person who shows up and places it without knowing in advance how many stones the wall will require. Frederick placed stones. He placed them every day. He placed them without asking whether they were enough yet, without expecting a receipt. And one morning in March, when the north fields were beginning to show the first green of spring, the fields that Caroline had saved, that they had walked together in January, that Alderton had told them were on track for the strongest yield in 6 years. Frederick came down to the estate office and found Caroline already there, already working, already half through her first cup of tea. She looked up when he came in. She said, "The Cooper roof is holding. I had Thomas check it yesterday." "Good." He sat down in the hard chair. He had long since stopped thinking of it as a chair for tenants and tradesmen. It was simply his chair, the one across from hers. Marsh's letter came this morning. He agrees with Alderton on the spring rotation. I thought he would. She looked back at her papers. I'll write to him tomorrow. I already did, Frederick said. Last night. She looked up. Something moved through her expression. Small, warm, the particular expression of a person who has seen something they did not expect and found that it pleased them. All right, she said simply. He opened his own correspondence. She returned to hers. The estate office was quiet in the way of rooms where people are working well, where the silence is populated rather than empty, where two people can be in the same space without filling it with noise and still be completely present to each other. After a while, without looking up from her letter, Caroline said, "There's a committee meeting in Harrow next month. Lady Harrington wants me to present the Pembroke wage model to the regional group." "I'll come with you," Frederick said. He did not look up either. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, not as an offer, not as a gesture, just as a fact about what was going to happen. A pause. Then, "You don't have to. I want to." He looked up then, and she was already looking at him. "I want to see what you've built. All of it. Not just the parts that happen here." She looked at him across the desk, across the accounts and the correspondence, and the careful accumulated evidence of who they were both becoming. She looked at him with the steady, clear eyes that had once watched him come up the drive and had refused to let him see how frightened she was. She was not frightened now. Neither was he. "All right," she said for the second time that morning, and this time the warmth in it was unmistakable. They went back to work. Outside, across the north fields of Pembroke Manor, the spring was coming in tentative at first, then with more confidence, the way all true things eventually arrive,